The frost hadn't lifted by noon, and that was the day they came to take everything Willa had left. She heard them before she saw them. 2 horses, 1 cart, the creak of iron wheels on frozen mud. She was standing at the window with her daughter, pressed against her side. Nell's small fingers curled into the wool of her skirt, and she didn't move. She just watched the car stop in front of the fence. Her husband had never finished building before the fever took him last March. The man who climbed down wasn't the banker himself. It was never the banker himself. It was a younger man, someone's clerk, with clean boots and a folded paper already in his hand. He walked to the door like he'd done this before, like he'd do it again tomorrow. She opened the door before he could knock. "Mrs. Willa Crane." He said it like a question even though it wasn't. "Just Willa," she said. "My husband's name was Crane." The clerk didn't blink. He held out the paper. She already knew what it said. $32, 4 months behind. The land, the cabin, the small root cellar she'd spent all of September filling. All of it attached to a debt Leland had signed before she'd even known the amount. "You have until the end of the week," the clerk said. Nell was 4 years old. She didn't understand the paper, but she understood her mother's silence, and she pressed closer. Willa took the paper. She thanked him, which she hated herself for later. She closed the door. She stood very still in the middle of the one room that had been her home for 3 years, and looked at the corner, where the straw mattress was, and the hook on the wall, where Leland's coat still hung, because she hadn't been able to take it down, and the small iron stove that took a full armload of wood just to push the cold back a few feet. $32. She had 11. She had nobody to ask. Her people were in Ontario, 2 weeks east by rail, and she hadn't written to them since the funeral, because she didn't know how to explain that she'd followed a man to the edge of the world, and now she was stuck there alone. Pride was a foolish thing to hold on to. She knew that. She held on to it anyway. By Wednesday she had a plan, which was not really a plan at all, but a direction. She would go to the settlement at Cutler's Creek and see about work, washing, mending, anything. She would bring Nell. She would figure it out the way she'd been figuring everything out for the past 8 months, which was mostly by not thinking too far ahead. She hitched the old mare to the small cart in the grey morning, and put Nell up front wrapped in 2 blankets, and they set off before the sun was fully up. The road to Cutler's Creek was not really a road, it was a suggestion of a road, frozen ruts and patches of ice, and the occasional stretch of mud that tried to swallow a wheel whole. The mare was slow. The sky was the color of pewter. They were 2 miles out when the wheel cracked. Not broke, cracked, but cracked was enough. The cart lurched and settled at an angle, and Willa climbed down and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Nell watched her from under the blankets. "Are we stuck?" Nell asked. "We're stuck," Willa said. She didn't cry. That was something she'd learned in the last 8 months. Crying used energy she didn't have to spare. She unhitched the mare, lifted Nell down, and they started walking. The settlement was still 1.5 miles ahead. The wind had picked up. Nell was too small to walk fast and too big to carry the whole way, so Willa did both in turns, carrying her until her arms gave out, setting her down, walking side by side with Nell's mittened hand in hers, until she could carry her again. They reached Cutler's Creek just past midday. It was not much. A trading post, a small church that doubled as a meeting hall, a handful of buildings that looked like they were deciding whether or not to fall down. There were people. That was what mattered. Willa went to the trading post first. A man named Greer ran it. He was not unkind, but he shook his head before she finished asking. "Nothing I can offer," he said. "Winter's hard on everyone." She tried 2 other doors. Same answer. She sat down on the step of the church with Nell in her lap and ate the half loaf of bread she'd brought, and thought about what came next. The sky had gone from pewter to the darker grey that meant more snow by evening. She didn't know she was being watched until the door of the church opened behind her. The woman who stepped out was older, 60s maybe, with the kind of face that had seen enough winters to stop being surprised by them. She looked at Willa and at Nell and at the bread, and she said, "Come inside." Her name was Mrs. Bodine. She gave them tea and did not ask a lot of questions, which Willa was grateful for. When Willa explained the situation, the debt, the broken cart, the week they had left, Mrs. Bodine sat with her hands folded and listened to the whole thing. "There's a man," she said when Willa finished. Willa waited. "Lives up the north slope. Name's Calloway." She paused. "He's not easy. He doesn't come down much, but he has money, and he has room, and his wife's been gone 6 years now. I'm not suggesting anything improper." She looked at Willa steadily. "I'm suggesting he might need a housekeeper, cook, someone to manage things. It'd be fair work for fair payment. He's alone up there. He is now. Had a hired man last spring, but the man left." She paused again, in the way people pause when there's a reason behind something they're choosing not to say directly. Willa looked at Nell, who had fallen asleep against her arm. "How far?" she asked. 4 miles up, maybe in this weather." "Not today," Mrs. Bodine said. "Tomorrow. If the snow holds off, I'll send word with Greer's boy tonight." Willa thought about the $11. She thought about the end of the week. She thought about Nell asleep with her mouth slightly open, a small sound in her breathing that wasn't quite a wheeze, but was something. Willa monitored the way you monitor a small fire, constantly, without appearing to. "All right," she said. The snow held off. Greer's boy, a quiet 12-year-old, led them up the north slope in the early morning with the mare. Someone had retrieved the cart, more or less, and Willa rode with Nell in front of her, and watched the trees get denser and the trail get narrower and the sky get whiter and more distant above the branches. She almost told the boy to turn around twice. She didn't. The cabin appeared between the trees with no warning, just suddenly there, larger than she'd expected, the logs dark with age and weather, a stack of firewood against one wall that was taller than she was, smoke from the chimney, a lean-to off to one side, 2 horses in a small paddock, both of them well-fed, which told her something. The boy stopped the mare. "I'll leave you here," he said, and before she could say anything, he had turned and was heading back down the trail. Willa sat for a moment. Nell was awake now, craning her head to see. "Big," Nell said. "Yes," Willa agreed. She climbed down. She lifted Nell down. She knocked on the door, which was solid and heavy, and took some knocking before anything happened. When it opened, she understood the pause Mrs. Bodine had left in her explanation. He was very large, not just tall. Large in the way that some men in this country got large, working alone in hard weather for years, the kind of size that came from necessity rather than vanity. He had a beard that needed attending to, and eyes that were a particular shade of grey-green that made her think of lichen on rock. He looked at her. He looked at Nell. He looked back at her. "You're Willa," he said. Didn't expect the child. She goes where I go." His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted. Not displeasure, something else, something she couldn't read yet. He stepped back from the door. "Come in, then," he said. She went in. The inside of the cabin was not what she'd expected, and she wasn't sure what she'd expected. It was clean, rough but clean. One large room with a proper stove, a table with 2 chairs, only 2, she noticed, shelves with organized supplies, a loft above with a ladder. No clutter, no disorder, the home of a man who had reduced his life to its necessary parts and kept those parts in order. He had made tea before they arrived. That surprised her more than anything else. "Calloway," he said. "Not my name is Calloway, just the word, standing alone." "Willa," she said. "And Nell." Nell had gone very still and was watching him. With the particular intensity children use on large animals, they haven't determined the temperament of yet. He glanced down at her once and then away, which seemed to satisfy some calculation Nell was running, because she stopped watching him so hard and looked around the cabin instead. "The work," he said. He didn't gesture. He barely moved. "Cooking. Keeping the place. Mending what needs mending. I'll pay $12 a month. lodging and food included. You can have the loft. $12 a month. She almost said that's more than fair, and stopped herself, because it was, and she didn't want him to know how much it mattered. I'll need wood for the stove through the night, she said instead. Nell feels the cold. He looked at the child. I'll keep it stocked, he said, and that was the arrangement. He didn't ask about her husband. She didn't ask about his wife. They had their tea across the wide table from each other, with Nell between them, eating a piece of dried apple that he had produced from a jar on the shelf without being asked, and they talked about practical things, where the supplies were, what needed doing, how often he went down to Cutler's Creek for provisions. And the snow began to fall outside, and Willa felt, for the first time since March, that she was going to be all right. She was not naive about it. She knew the feeling would pass, that it would be hard, that there were 10 things she didn't know yet about this man or this mountain. But the stove was hot, and Nell was eating, and outside the snow was falling on someone else's problem for at least one night. That was enough. It had to be. The first 2 weeks were a negotiation conducted entirely without words. Calloway had his ways of doing things, built over years of doing them alone. And Willa had her ways, and the cabin was not large enough for those 2 sets of ways to ignore each other. She learned fast. He rose before light. She heard him, the careful movements that weren't careful enough to be silent, the door easing open and closed. She began rising before him, and having the stove going by the time he came back in from checking the horses. The first morning she did it, he stopped in the doorway for a moment, said nothing, and came to the table. He ate everything she put in front of him. That was a kindness she hadn't expected, though she suspected it was less about the food and more about something in his character that didn't see the point in wastefulness. Nell warmed to him before Willa did. Children are practical that way. They judge on evidence. The evidence, from Nell's perspective, was he was quiet and didn't shout. He fixed the rung on the ladder to the loft without being asked, because he'd noticed it wobbling when she climbed, and one evening he had brought in a piece of carved wood from the lean-to, a small horse, rough but recognizable, the kind of thing a man makes in the long winter evenings when there is nothing else to do, and set it on the table next to her cup without looking at her, or explaining it, and then went back to whatever he'd been doing. Nell named it Brindle and slept with it. Willa watched all of this and kept her own counsel, because she was a woman who had learned that watching carefully was the best information available, and what she was watching told her things about him that she hadn't expected. He was not gentle in the way she'd been told men could be gentle. He was not warm, not outwardly, but he was. She searched for the word and came back to steady. He was steady in a way that had become unfamiliar to her, because Leland, for all his qualities, had not been steady. Leland had been charming and generous and full of plans, and also, when the plans didn't work, prone to a kind of silent collapse that left Willa managing everything alone while appearing not to. Calloway didn't have plans. He had habits. He was there every morning. He came in from the cold and hung things in the same place, and did what needed doing without announcement. It was not romantic. It was something more useful. She was still careful, though. She was careful because she had known one man well, and she understood that men were unknowable in the specific ways that mattered, and she had Nell to think about. She was careful because she'd arrived here out of desperation, and desperation was a terrible lens for seeing things clearly. She was careful, and she watched, and the weeks passed. The trouble came in the 4th week. She was alone in the cabin. Calloway had gone down to the settlement for supplies, expected back by dark, when she heard the horses. 2 of them, unfamiliar sounds, not his. Nell was asleep in the loft. Willa went to the window. 2 men she didn't know. One of them had a face she didn't like on instinct, sharp-featured, and smiling in the way that smiling isn't always friendly. The other was broader, slower-looking, following the first one's lead. They tied their horses at the paddock without asking and came toward the cabin. She opened the door before they reached it. Her mother had always said, "Don't let them get to the door before you, because the door is yours and you open it on your terms." "He's not here," she said. "Who's not here?" the sharp-faced one said, still smiling. "Calloway. He'll be back this evening. Didn't say we were looking for Calloway." He was looking at the cabin, at the windows, at her, the kind of looking that adds things up. "New arrangement up here?" "Not your business," she said. The broader man shifted his weight. The sharp-faced one took one step closer. Dalt said, "This cabin had supplies worth knowing about." She said. It was not a word. It was a door closing. She said it with the whole weight of 8 months behind it. 8 months of figuring out, of hauling, of managing, of standing in that room in that cabin in Saskatchewan, with a paper in her hand and $11 and a sleeping 4-year-old. And it landed the way she meant it to. The sharp-faced man stopped. His smile went thin. "Come back when Calloway's here," she said. "If you have business, have it with him." Something in her face must have told him what he needed to know. He looked at her for a moment longer, then tipped his hat in a way that wasn't a courtesy, and turned and walked back to the horses. The broader man followed. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it and breathed. Nell was still asleep. Good. Calloway came back 2 hours later, just before dark. She told him about the men, described them, what they'd said, the name they'd mentioned. His face did the thing it sometimes did, went very still in a particular way that she was starting to understand was not blankness but concentration. "Dalt," he said. "That's the name they used." He put down the supplies. He looked at the door for a moment. "They won't come back tonight," he said. "Snow. And tomorrow?" He looked at her then, directly, which he didn't always do. "Tomorrow I'll handle it." She didn't ask what handle it meant. She found she trusted the answer, which surprised her because she didn't trust easily and especially not on 4 weeks of evidence. But there it was. He handled it. She didn't see the whole of it. He was gone most of the morning, came back with the kind of quiet that meant something had concluded. Later she would hear from Mrs. Bodine, on a trip to the settlement, that Dalt's 2 men had ridden out of the area and weren't expected back. Whatever Calloway had said or done, it had been enough. He didn't tell her the details. She didn't ask for them. But that evening, at the table, he poured 2 cups of coffee. He'd brought real coffee back from the settlement, not chicory, and set one in front of her, and it was the kind of gesture that meant something without either of them saying what it meant. Nell looked between them. "Can I have some?" she asked. "No," they both said, at the same time. It was the first time Willa had heard him come close to anything like a laugh. It was just a breath of air, not a real laugh, but it was there, and Nell looked delighted by it, which delighted Willa in a way she didn't examine too closely. The shirt smelled like him. The shift happened gradually. The way shifts in this country happened under the surface, while everything above the surface looked the same. He started asking her opinion on things. Small things first. Whether the east wall of the lean-to needed shoring up before the next hard frost. Whether she thought the mare's left foreleg was favoring, or whether he was imagining it. She had opinions on both. He listened to them. Not performed listening, actual listening. The kind where the information lands and you can see it landing. She started telling him more than he asked, not her history. She wasn't ready for that, and she wasn't sure she would be. But the small daily things, what Nell had said that morning, what she'd noticed about the way the wind was coming from the northeast, a story about her grandmother that she hadn't thought of in years, and suddenly found herself telling him over supper. He told her one thing about his wife. Just one thing. He told her she'd been from Quebec, and that she'd hated the winters, which he'd known before they married, and which she'd known she'd hate, and which neither of them had been deterred by, because they'd both believed love was more practical than weather. "Was it?" Willa asked. He thought about that for a while. "For a while," he said. She didn't ask more. He didn't offer more. But the door had opened a crack, which was its own kind of answer. The hardest morning came in the 6th week. Nell woke up with a fever. Not a bad fever, not the kind that Willa's worst fear knew how to build into catastrophe, but a fever, and a chest that rattled a little when she breathed. And Willa sat with her in the loft with a damp cloth and counted the child's breaths the way she'd counted them as a newborn, and the old helpless terror that lived in every parent who had ever been far from a doctor sat on her chest and breathed with her. She didn't hear Calloway on the ladder until he was at the top of it. He took in the situation in one look. He came down without a word, and she heard him at the stove, and 20 minutes later he came back up with a pot of something that smelled of pine, and something else, something sharp and clean, and a cloth. "Pine, pitch, and camphor," he said. "My mother used it." He held the pot near Nell's face, let the steam do its work. He did it for a long time, longer than Willa expected him to have patience for, and Nell's breathing eased. Not all the way, but enough. Willa looked at him from across her daughter's head. "Where did you learn that?" she said. "North of here," he said. "My brother was sickly as a child." He paused. He grew out of it. There was, in that, more information than the words themselves carried. A family, somewhere a childhood, that included a mother and a brother, a life before this mountain. She filed it away. She didn't know what she was building a picture of, or why, except that she was. By evening Nell's fever had broken. She demanded the carved horse and supper, in that order, which was a reliable sign that she was fine. Willa went and stood outside in the cold for a few minutes. The sky was clear, and there were more stars than the sky should reasonably be able to hold. She heard the door behind her. He didn't say anything. He came and stood near her, not close, but near, looking at the same sky. "Thank you," she said. "She's a good child," he said. Willa looked at the stars. "She is," she said. They stood there for a while in the cold, and it didn't need to be anything more than what it was, and that was something she hadn't known she was missing until just then. The particular peace of standing next to someone who didn't require anything from her, who was just there, solid and quiet and real. Spring came the way it always came in that country, like a rumor that took a long time to be confirmed. First the light coming back in increments, then the sound of water under the ice, then one morning a particular quality to the air that wasn't warmth exactly, but was the memory of warmth, a promise the land was making. Willa had been on the mountain for 3 months. She had not written to her people in Ontario. She had meant to, had written the letter 3 times in her head, and not once on paper, because she didn't know yet what she would say. "I'm on a mountain in the north, with a man I've known 3 months, who keeps the wood stocked and made my daughter a horse, and stood in the cold with me and looked at the stars." That was true, but it didn't explain anything. One morning in early April she came in from bringing feed to the horses, and Calloway was at the table. He had a piece of paper in front of him and a pen, and he looked up when she came in. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I'd like you to know before I ask it that if the answer is no, nothing changes. You'd stay through the summer. I wouldn't make it strange." She waited. He looked at the paper. He was not a man who looked away from things, but he was looking at the paper. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Past the arrangement, not as a housekeeper." The stove ticked. Outside, a bird, the first bird she'd heard in months. "Say the rest of it," she said. He looked up. "I'm not." He stopped. "I'm not good at this. My wife used to say I spoke in subtitles, that you had to know what was under the words to understand the words." "I'm listening to what's under them," Willa said. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically. He wasn't a dramatic man, but enough. "I'd like you and Nell to stay," he said. "I'd like." He stopped again. He set the pen down. "I'd like to know if there's a chance." The bird outside made its sound again, small and clear in the new air. Willa thought about Ontario. She thought about Leland. She thought about Nell sleeping in the loft with the carved horse tucked under her arm, and the pine and camphor steam, and 2 cups of coffee. and they both said no at the same time. "There's a chance," she said. He nodded. He picked up the pen. He looked at the paper, which she now realized was blank. Whatever he'd planned to write, he hadn't written it yet. "I should tell you some things," she said. "About before. About Leland." "When you're ready," he said. "I might not be ready for a while. That's all right." She got up and put more wood in the stove. When she turned around, he was still at the table, not watching her, just there. Present. That steadiness that wasn't warmth exactly, but was something she'd decided she needed more than warmth, something that would last the winters, which in this country were long and serious, and required more than warmth to survive, she thought. This is what it looks like. I didn't know, but this is what it looks like. She put the kettle on. Upstairs, Nell stirred and called down, "Is there porridge?" in the voice of someone who had decided the day, had started whether or not the adults were ready. Calloway looked at the ceiling, then back at Willa. "There'll be porridge," Willa called up. She caught his eye. "There's always porridge." The corners of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, but near enough. Outside, the birds sang again in the warming air, and somewhere below them on the mountain, the ice was going out of the creek, and spring was becoming more than a rumor, and the morning was just beginning.